Greetings and salutations and welcome to a public service announcement. I don't do these very often, but I've discovered something which is very, very interesting. Now, I'm not saying that I'm necessarily right, but this is something that needs to be taken into consideration. I've crunched the numbers between Black Cleaver and Last Whisper. I've looked at how they affect your total DPS using the DPS calculator that is in leaguecraft.com and using the stats of Victor as a guide, because Victor is what raised the argument. So armor is calculated, and I'll try and have this displayed on screen. It affects a damage multiplier. Your damage multiplier is 100 divided by 100 plus the champion's armor. So, if the target has no armor, you deal 100% of your damage. If they've got 50 armor, if they have 100 armor, they take 50% reduced damage. It's math stuff. Because it then becomes 100 divided by 200, which is of course a half, so you've got a 0.5 damage multiplier. You only deal half your damage. So, let's look at Victor's DPS now, and again, I will try to have these on screen, but we'll see how I go with syncing. If you don't have any other items, Victor's DPS is 65. That's with no items at all. At max level, he's got 75 damage per second. With a Last Whisper alone, he's got 90 damage per second. With a Black Cleaver, he has 130 damage per second. So, if you attack someone with 100 armor, you essentially halve the calculation for his base damage per second. You get 32.5 DPS. However, Last Whisper and Black Cleaver both apply armor reductions in different ways. Last Whisper is a percentage armor reduction. So the damage multiplier becomes 100 divided by 100 plus 60 instead, because it's 40% armor pen, leaving you with 57.25 damage per second. Black Cleaver does it differently. You shred some of their armor every hit. 15 to be precise, stacking 3 times. And so, this is assuming that you've got all 3 stacks on a target, because it's too difficult to calculate otherwise. Assuming you've got those stacks on, you've got 83.871 damage per second. Continuing on to a target with 200 armor, your base DPS becomes 21.667. With a Last Whisper, your DPS is 40.909. With a Black Cleaver, against a target with 200 armor, assuming that you've got the 3 stacks applied, you have a DPS of 50.98. Now, there is a lot to be said for those first 3 attacks. They will be less powerful than what you would have if you had a Last Whisper, because your DPS stays at a certain amount. It doesn't ramp up as the fight continues. However, that is an increase in DPS of 10 damage per second. And in the make-believe scenario that you've not bought any other items, that would have a significant impact against any champion, because 40 damage per second is like, you've got a 25% increase to get to the Black Cleaver of 50 damage per second. Technically 51. Sure, your first 2 hits aren't going to be that good, but the 3rd and 4th are going to be significantly better in terms of DPS, and sustaining a fight against a single target will render amazing results in terms of your damage. Now let's look at it with the full item build that I suggested for Victor, which consisted of a Phantom Dancer, Infinity Edge, Triforce, Berserker's Greaves, and Victor's Augment Power. Now DPS at this point, the average DPS has to include critical chance, which I believe is included in the DPS calculator of the Leaguecraft website. If it doesn't, then criticals will apply a much larger impact. Okay, with those items that I've just said, your DPS as Victor is going to be 578. If you then add a Last Whisper as your final item, you have 687 DPS. If you instead add a Black Cleaver, you have 831 DPS. Against a target with only 100 armor, which, let's be honest, that actually, assuming some things like, when we're not including runes and masteries because that would add way too many variables, but Rammus doesn't even have 100 armor unless he ball curls or buys other items. His base armor is about 80 something. There's a lot of champions who don't get much more than 100 armor because they're deciding to purely build for damage output. So there are quite a few champions with only 100 or 110 armor toward the later stages of the game. So without either Last Whisper or Black Cleaver, you've got 289 DPS against a target with 100 armor. If you have Last Whisper as your last item, you will have 429.375 DPS. Big increase. Armor penetration is very important. If you have a Black Cleaver with all 3 stacks on the target, your DPS is 537.129. That is more than 100 extra damage every second. I don't even need to tell you that that's a lot, because it simply is. Now ramping it up more to a target with 200 armor, without either you've got 129.667 DPS. If you choose to go for the Last Whisper, you've got 312 DPS. 0.273. With a Black Cleaver instead, you've got 325.882 DPS. Your DPS is still higher at 200 armor on the enemy champion, but only after the first 3 stacks. So from your 4th hit and onward, you will have a greater DPS, and only by a very small margin. So it comes down to the scenario of how you're playing. If you're not hitting the same target consistently, get a Last Whisper, because Black Cleaver relies on you targeting down a single person. If you are up against a champion who is very, very squishy, get a Black Cleaver. If that's who you're trying to kill faster, the Black Cleaver is superior, because they're not going to have 200 armor. And even if they do, because they're squishy, you're going to shred them regardless of what item you go for. If you are up against a champion who is very, very healthy, but not so big on the armor, has 200 armor or less, I would go for the Black Cleaver, because you're more likely to get to and sustain the 3 stacks on the Black Cleaver, and while you're doing that, the rest of your team can assist you in destroying them. That is your option for, say, after a team fight when the fully stacked Cho'Gath is running away because he knows that he can basically take all the abuse in the world. You can take him down while you chase him, if you have the Black Cleaver. The Last Whisper is going to be less useful in that regard. Yeah, you might still get him, but there's a greater chance of him escaping because you're not going to have the same DPS, and your team isn't going to have the same DPS. So, the only situation when a Last Whisper becomes more useful is against champions with low health but high armor, or incredibly high armor, 300 and beyond, probably even 250 and beyond, because that's when the percentage starts to have a much, much greater impact than the flat in terms of the armor reduction. Yes, Last Whisper will also have a greater impact in solo fights, because you don't get the extra damage from your teammates. But how many times do you want to fight solo if you're an AD carry in the late game? I'm not saying that you shouldn't get Last Whisper or that it's a terrible item, but on everything I can think of, I would rather have a Black Cleaver. Some champions won't make as much use of it as others, but if your positioning is good, you're not going to be in a situation where you're in particular danger and need to focus someone down very, very quickly. So, why not have the Black Cleaver to make the most from your entire team and not just yourself, after you've killed off the squishies, because they're dead in 3 hits regardless of which item you went for. That's just how I looked at it. I crunched the numbers myself. There may be mistakes, so feel free to let me know if I am actually wrong. If you think I'm wrong, feel free to rant at me because I can't stop you. It's preference based, guys. I think Black Cleaver is better. Thank you all for listening to me rant about Black Cleaver versus Last Whisper, and good night.